All right, so moving to the rear damage. As a review, this is where the V-bar was when it hit the road, so there's a little compression damage in this area. Not anywhere near as bad as on the front, on the other side, but still there's a little bit. To begin with, there's a crack above the seam that runs along here. You can barely see it because I started sanding, but maybe right here you can make out some of it. And it continues to about where this dot is. So there's a little crack there. The seam was kind of busted up and compromised, so I had taken that off. And then there's a couple hairline cracks under here. I've got them marked here and I need to sand those. So here are those areas after the sanding was completed, and then again after the carbon was laid up and the edges all feathered. Okay, looking at the damage from the inside, there's the crack on the upper hull just above that Kevlar tape running from that arrow on the left across to about where that arrow on the right is. Now they also glued the hull halves together with some glue that blebbed out on the inside, and it kind of would make it hard to kind of lay up a nice layer of carbon, so I took a needle nose plier and snapped that off in that section there. Here's that glue here. Doesn't sand very well. And here are the two lower hull cracks highlighted. So I'll just mention that it was very awkward doing that work on the interior. Very hard to see what you were doing, especially when your hand was in the hatch I made, then you couldn't really see. So you're kind of doing it blind. I'd use a mirror to kind of see what I had done or what I needed to do, but overall I found it very awkward, but I managed to figure it out. So here are those areas, the seam and the crack above the seam and the two lower cracks all laid up with carbon. Okay, so the last thing to do before I could close up the hull was to resecure the rudder line tubes that had come loose from under the rear deck. Now they were held in place in three sites. The two near ones that you can see hanging there were sleeve type holders, and the rear one looked to be Kevlar and epoxy just strung across the tube. The tubes are also secured along the side of the cockpit going forward, but those were intact and still attached. Now, to make it a little easier and to use gravity to help assist, I kind of lifted up the ski and rolled it over so I could stand underneath it and work easily and use gravity to help me hold those tubes down while I was refastening those points. Again, this was awkward work, but I was able to reattach the two sleeve holders after roughening things up a bit with sandpaper and then using thickened epoxy. I was able to fasten those two down. Obviously, that farther site that the tube was connected to, I couldn't reach. So hopefully these two sites will be sufficient. So I closed the rear hatches up in the same fashion that I closed the front hatch up, using the hull as kind of a mold and the pieces I cut out laid onto some carbon to make some lips that I put a thickened epoxy onto and then clamped them to the underside. And then I put thickened epoxy in the holes and the cracks and then laid that up with carbon. And so it's very nice and satisfying to get the hull closed up. A bit of an aside here, I had these areas that the rudder yoke was dinging up into the gel coat and the composite. So I went ahead and put some layers of fiberglass on there, and at some point I will also put a little gel coat on there to give it a little more durability. All right, so moving on to the last bit of damage to be addressed at the stern. You can see this seam here is split, and there's a pretty good ding right here where that dry fiberglass tape that seals the seam is exposed. And then going around to the other side, it got a pretty good whack here. This seam also is compromised, and Up here, you can see some stress cracking. I think you can get that on the video here and up here. So we'll have to put some carbon on there, and I'll remove this seam all the way around and redo the seam there. So here are those areas sanded and ready for layup. I think I'll use fiberglass on the seam for a little better impact resistance, and then carbon on top. Okay, the seam is fiberglassed. The carbon is laid up on those top cracks, and it's all feathered. So the repairs are all officially done now. So the next step is to do a whole bunch of gel coat. So we'll see how that goes. It should be an interesting endeavor.